at Paul's letters chronologically, First and Second Thessalonians may be the earliest. There's some people that put in Galatians, but I'm going with Ben in First and Second Thessalonians, around 51 A.D. So there were real challenges for them, and yeah, go ahead and get that if you like.
He's got to take.
He's got a call he's got to take. That's okay. That's all right. But then they come through, and as often happens, not often happens, but regrettably with me happens. I had 3 or 4 pieces of paper. I had all my notes on. The one that I had, the chronology of Paul's epistles was left at home. But anyway, all right. How many letters did Paul write?
I don't remember, is it 13? Is it 13?
That's a good answer.
Close?
There may be another answer, but
Is there a prize?
That's
I'll
just
guess.
my word.
But-
Prizes now.
there's a question about another one.
Oh.
What might that be?
Hebrews.
Hebrews. And interestingly, early on, for many centuries, it was thought to be one of his, but from the 18th century on, there was some question, and there's not as much consensus on that now. Regardless, he wrote 13. How many books in the New Testament? Got it, 27. Okay, so that makes pretty much Paul is a writer of about half of the New Testament. That's a remarkable thing, and I think makes him so important for not only the early church, but for us today, because God through him has left so much material for us to study and to absorb and to use to guide our lives as we live for him today. He searched back, his books. One he wrote, of course, there's the Gospels, Acts, which Jack did a great job on Sunday morning, this last quarter, and then Paul's letters, and then you get to, the general epistles, Peter, and John, Jude, and then, the outlier, which is Revelation from John, and so that's kind of where we have been right here. And interestingly, this study, we've studied all of Paul's letters now. That's been an intentional thing. And so this is the last roundup, folks. Last roundup. Starting 50 to 51, you go through, there are, all the way through 52, 55, 56, 58. Then you get into the 60s, they're the prison epistles. There are 4 of those, that he wrote from prison. And then these, and then there's Philemon's the last one of those. And then we have now the pastoral epistles, which are,
First and Second Timothy, Titus.
that's right, there are 3 of them, okay? First and Second Timothy and Titus. But for purposes of our class, we want to think of them as 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy. And that will come apparent, hopefully, as we, move through this. These were written by Paul to 2 of his closest proteges, Timothy and Titus. And first of all, what's a pastoral anyway? What's the root word here?
Pastor.
Okay. Okay. All right, what in New Testament times was a pastor? What was another word for him?
Rabbi?
No. It wasn't it wasn't a religious term.
Sure.
What is it? Shepherd.
It's related to pasture and
Right,
sheep.
other things that come from, where you come from, pasture. Pastoral, what does that mean? In non-religious terms, when people use it today. Kind of a nice, calm, rural scene, right? Setting.
It's green,
Green,
got grass.
got grass, and, and again, with on the grass, there's maybe some animals that are sheep, maybe, okay. So anyway, all right. So these are, it relates to the things that he gives specific instructions in, which part of the instructions that he gives to Titus and to Timothy are about oversight, shepherding of the church and establishing that in the places where he has left them. But that's not all, and that's only a small part of what these books are about. You could also call them ministerial epistles, because what do you have here? Who do you have? You've got Timothy and you've got Titus. Who are Timothy and Titus? Just they're young guys, aren't they? They're young guys who have been working with Paul, and he's left them on their own, and they've got to do ministry where they are. And so it's a ministerial book as well. So I think we need to make sure that we don't need to get too honed in just on the pastoral part here. But that's kind of the genesis of the term that is used to classify these books. First Timothy and Titus are kind of similar in their content and similar in their message. There are, how many are there? Let me look here, my notes here. Where did I have that? Oh, that was on that other piece of paper, wasn't it? 6 chapters in 1 Timothy. I think there are only 3 in 2 Timothy, and there are 5 in Titus. But they're written to 2 guys in different places who are kind of the same and have the same roles. But the next thing is, who are these guys? Who's Timothy and who's Titus? Jack mentioned it toward the end of his class, maybe not the last class or the next to the last class, but by the time he got to the end of Acts, Paul had accumulated and trained about 40 people that were his assistants and his followers that helped, with his ministry. These 2 guys are 2 of those. Timothy is one that's probably more familiar to us. We first encounter Timothy in Lystra. Paul's first missionary journey, okay? That's where Paul got beat up. Had a good experience. This was a lot better coming out of, the only thing good that ever came out of Lystra for Paul was probably Timothy, okay? But he was introduced there in 16th chapter, and this was right after the Jerusalem Council in 15, where they went back, and he and Barnabas went back and explained to the church, the Judean church there in Jerusalem, that, lo and behold, the Gentiles had received the word, They had received the Spirit, and so there was a great meeting of the minds that says, yes, God is working in the Gentiles as well. You guys go back out, and boom. So he and Barnabas are going to go on this first missionary journey. Well, in Lystra, they pick up this guy, Timothy. And this guy, Timothy, accompanies them. And interestingly, if you just kind of follow Paul's journeys all the way through, Timothy's almost always there. He's almost always there. So, and clearly we'll see in the second letter of Timothy, he was a favorite. He was his favorite guy. And so I think that's important to know as well. He went with Paul. He was with Ephesus. In Ephesus, where he was there for 3 years, a long time. And matter of fact, that's probably where he was left. And when Paul went and let him go to Macedonia, he probably sent this letter back to her, the first letter, while he's still in Ephesus. What about his family? What do you know about Timothy's family? He's from Lystra, okay.
Mixed marriage.
Mixed marriage. His mother, Eunice, was a Jewess. She was a believer. And his grandmother was Lois. And Paul in this, talks about them teaching him the word and how important that was. But his father was a Greek. That's all it says. No name. Don't know what happened to him, whether he ever became a believer or not.
He's related to Timothy though, right? Paul's related to Timothy?
No.
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 No, he
They're
calls
really
him.
close,
He
though.
calls him.
Close in faith.
He's my son in the faith, and that's how close they were.
I was thinking it was like a nephew or something like that.
No, but he probably treated him like a
Yeah.
kid, and that was a whole part of the dynamic of their relationship that was so important in the history of the church in the first century. He's mentioned in 6 of Paul's letter. In the beginning, talking about, I'm here with so greetings from me and whoever. And so he was really an important part, long term.
He was there with the Thessalonians.
Thessalonians, right, exactly. So really a critically important person here. And one of the things that I think is important for us too is to remember that he was in Ephesus when he received this first letter. We're just going to talk the first letter right now from Paul. But he'd been there for 3 years. And this was a relatively well-developed church by that time. And so, there's some differences there related to that. And one of the interesting things I saw, and I don't know if it has any credence or not, but there are instructions about qualifications and appointment of elders in Titus as well as in 1 Timothy. But there's also mention of deacons in 1 Timothy, but not in Titus. And the question in my mind, is this because it was a less mature church in Crete, and the main thing was getting elders first, and then maybe perhaps later on they would have deacons appointed to help with the work there. So, a very important person Timothy is. Titus, I kind of think of these guys as the same age, but I don't know. Nobody knows. But it appears that they were generationally about the same. He's never mentioned in Acts. never mentioned in Acts, as opposed to Timothy, who's quite prominent. But, as Jack pointed out in his Acts class, those of you who are really paying attention, indirectly he was there. Because in Galatians 2, he is mentioned as a Greek convert of Paul and a companion with Paul and Barnabas with the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. As opposed to Timothy, who Paul had circumcised when he picked him up at Lystra, and then they started on this journey. Why do you think he did that, by the way? This has been alluded to. We've talked about this a little bit before. Can't say for 100% sure, but yes, George.
You know, the possible objection from the Gentiles about circumcision, or the Jews about circumcision.
Right, yeah.
It wasn't a necessity, it's just shut people up.
Well, I think,
It's not a point to argue.
well, I think you're
Yeah.
right. I think it was an expediency.
Yeah.
Relative to what he thought he was gonna be running into. Of course, Judaizing teachers were already, and he just didn't wanna, perhaps that wasn't a hill he didn't wanna die on.
It wasn't gonna hurt anything.
No.
It's gonna didn't hurt. That's not right. I'm saying
Let's rephrase that.
spiritually it didn't hurt.
No, it was not.
Otherwise, yeah.
And it is important, what you're saying, it really is, it's important. I don't think that this was a capitulation to the Judaizing teachers. It was not that.
I find it interesting that he wasn't as a child if his mother was
That's what I
a Jew.
was thinking.
Yeah.
Because being born to mixed marriage, if a mother was a Jew, he was a Jew.
Well, maybe that didn't happen in
Maybe we have
Lystra.
to ask that later on when we get
Yeah,
there.
put that on that list, of questions you're gonna ask.
Not a question I'll ask, really, but anyway.
All right, but it's, but Titus wasn't
Wasn't what?
circumcised. But he
He was Greek?
was Greek. Okay,
You wonder why they weren't.
Because he was all Greek?
evidently.
What'd you say?
There's no mention of him having mixed parentage.
Right, so he's
He's
just
full-
a Gentile.
And I think, for my, and again, this is me kind of reaching out a little bit. But here he is, Paul takes him to Jerusalem. That's a nice song.
I'm sorry, I
That's
didn't
okay.
think I had my phone in here.
That's okay. But anyway, but he takes him to Jerusalem. What's the whole point of their trip to Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Paul and Barnabas
To
and Titus.
talk about the Gentiles being welcomed into the kingdom.
Yeah. And not having to be a Jew.
That's right. As Gentiles, yeah.
That's why he wasn't a Jew.
There is no more Jew nor Greek,
Yeah.
slave nor free.
Bond free, male to female. But I think it fits nicely into that message that they were delivering. Hey, the Gentiles are, they don't have to become a Jew first. Then say, okay, he's a Greek. No need for him to be circumcised. And matter of fact, kind of using that as, we don't want to get into this too deeply, he's not showing, but he does not have to be, he is fully a Christian without circumcision. And maybe he is an example of that as Paul then moves along with him in his company and show, hey, listen, Titus, he's a Christian. I'm a Jew, I was circumcised, Tyler, Benjamin, all of that. But, he came to Christ and he's a Greek. No need for that. You don't do that. That's not necessary. That's not important. So that's a little bit of a difference and a little contrast between who they were and kind of their religious
Of course,
impact. Yeah,
Paul, obviously, in Paul's mission, always their first stop in these cities was the
synagogue, that's right.
So maybe Paul's just talked to Timothy and say, hey, it'd be a lot easier for us to go into the synagogue and be able to talk if you
Yeah,
got a little something we need to chat about. But
yeah.
wow,
And no, I think, that's, we're kind of trying to put it all together, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
It seems more reasonable
Yeah.
for the son of a Jewish mother
Yes,
for the Jewish party,
right,
to be more concerned with him
yes.
than they would with the guy who was not got any connection to being a
No
Jew.
good news from being a Jew. That's right, yeah.
when did Titus come into the picture with Paul? Was it later?
Well, no, I think,
Timothy
for
was very
Galatians
early.
2, he was with Paul
All right, so that's
and
very
Barnabas
early
when
as
they
well.
went to Jerusalem, for
Yeah.
the Jerusalem
It's
Council.
very early, yeah.
Yeah, so
Well,
it's very early, yeah. So both of them, he's indirectly introduced in 15, and Timothy is in the first part of Acts 16,
okay.
when he went to Lystra.
But you're talking about probably 10 years between the Jerusalem Council and writing of Titus.
Oh, yeah,
So this question has been settled for quite a long time.
Right.
Even though they made these concessions to the Jews because of their sensitivity. They made food concessions. And, people had been practicing these Jewish customs for centuries and centuries.
Sure.
And so they were quite sensitive to that, and they said, well, we'll go ahead and not offend these people, because we're trying to what? We're trying to convert them.
Right,
So let's not offend them right off the bat
yeah.
by eating something they're gonna get all upset about.
They weren't spiritual issues, so why would you cause a big fuss about it? Wasn't that what they were thinking?
well,
It's more about, getting their foot in the door with
Yeah,
the Jews.
Yeah.
And getting them to listen to what they have to say,
not criticizing everything right away,
and rather than starting off with a negative,
yeah.
let's sit down and have a big raw steak, and then we'll discuss the gospel.
yeah,
They would have been highly offended. So,
But it wasn't compromising anything spiritually important, that's the thing.
that gets back to the thing, starts with Peter up on the housetop, vision coming down, all this food. God says, eat. He says, no, Lord, I can't. And he says, yeah, everything is good. That prepared him to go to Cornelius, the Greek, first Greek, boom, they're accepted. And then you have these markers of Gentile acceptance, into the church. The most important, I think, must have been the council in Jerusalem, though, where the Jews there and the mother church and the leaders there said, yes, they are our brothers and they're our sisters. But that had to be kind of a tough nut to crack all over the Mediterranean area for, whether it was Paul or whether it was Silas or Timothy or Titus. There had to be enclaves of people that maybe hadn't even heard about that, or were resistant to it just because of their strong Jewish heritage. So,
Is it possible that rather than Paul pursuing circumcision with Titus or Timothy as to what he wanted them to do, as opposed to Timothy having a preference and Titus having a preference and Paul saying, you have that opportunity?
as I recall, it said that Paul had him circumcised.
That's true.
And so, now maybe I'm reading between the lines, and I'm reading it between the lines differently than you are. And my study said that Paul says, we need for you to be circumcised. Or you're maybe saying, you know, that Timothy's saying, I've got a Jewish mother, perhaps I should be circumcised for the furtherance of our ministry and to make it. Don't know. Put that one down too, on that list of questions. Okay.
I'll start a list for us.
But yeah, but don't you have a list of things you want to ask when you get to heaven?
Yeah.
Anybody else do that? Just-
Well, I wanna have a big, long conversation with Jason of Thessalonica.
Yeah, yeah.
Paul was skipping town, he gets thrown in jail.
Yes, what did
I
you?
wanna hear.
Yeah, he fell on the sword for it, didn't he?
Yeah.
He really did.
I wanna have a cup of coffee
One
with
of,
him.
one of the other things is the distance from Jerusalem.
Oh, yeah.
In Crete, you would have probably had very few Jews.
Yeah.
And, this guy who's a Greek, he's just a believer. You don't have as many Jews there probably as you would in Galatia
Yeah, and then,
and Ephesus.
yes, these large, we talked about that, Paul going to these large population areas, and they almost always had a synagogue, almost always had it, and that's the first place he went. So, yeah, and it's interesting, where is it? I forget where, somebody was talking about the Cretans that really bad mouthing the Cretans, that they're, that they were just, that's where we get the word, you're a Cretan. That's not a real nice thing to have something said.
All Cretans are liars.
Yeah, all Cretans are liars, that's right, yeah, and that's from scripture, so, but it was a little different. They're an isolated island and, there weren't daily, planes coming in and out, so they were isolated. So anyway, so that's kind of, who these guys are and, how important they were for Paul and his ministry. And if in Paul's ministry, then, for the spread of the gospel in the then known world. Probably, Timothy's, again, he was already in a place where the church had been well established there in Ephesus. So his experience was going to be a little different than Titus was in Crete. There's no mention of Paul being in Crete in Acts, but it's thought that his fourth missionary journey, which at the end, 28 of Acts, just kind of stops. He's in jail, but it's felt that he got out of that before he didn't get, capital punishment at that time, but he was, and then he went on he talked about it, wanted to go to Spain, he wanted to do this and that. And that was a part of this tour, and he went through Crete and established the church there. This was in mid-60s, maybe 64. So Titus is there, a church that hadn't been there very long. So there were, and again, with it being an island, was there less, heretical influence from, the Judaizing teachers and from other people who were starting to get off track, in Christianity. So we don't know for sure, but he kind of gave them essentially the same charge though. First of all, boom, what are we going to do? We're going to set things in order in the church. Let's get the church organized. That's important. And the first thing you do with that is what?
Like leaders.
Leadership. So, was a point of, these are the kind of guys that you need to be looking for. And let's get on with that. Let's get that established first. And then, worship, he addresses that. He addresses instruction to different little groups of people, or widows, women, slaves, There are gonna be all kinds of different things that he's gonna be giving instructions relative to their role and how they need to live within the church family. And then also, the key is so that they can have order, unity, and peace, and so that the church can flourish. Both of them have instructions about what they're gonna be up against with opposition. There are gonna be people that are going to oppose them. There are gonna be people who are going to say, hey, these guys, they don't know it all, you know. I've got special knowledge in this, maybe get into some early Gnosticism or other heresies that arose in the mid to late first century. And this is what you're gonna have to deal with, and this is how you deal with it. You stick with what I've told you. I've told you the gospel. I've, been with you, Timothy, for years. You've been at my feet learning, so you know how to do this. Titus, you've been with me on this journey, this fourth missionary journey, we think. And you've been at my feet, you've had my instructions, and so you know what to do. Stick with it. Stick with it. Manage these things. And so, because, the health of the church is critical, and you have to oppose that. And then he also just, he encourages these guys, both of them. They're young guys. And say, hey, remember the thing with Timothy, don't let anybody despise your youth. Nobody in here that can get that tonight, that kind of instructions or, Let nobody despise your age, perhaps your aged condition. You still got some worth, maybe. Maybe that would be the message for us. But it says don't do that, And I think probably if I'm looking at it and these guys, wouldn't it be great? Paul's left us, he's been there, and then he's gone. Okay, well, who's gonna pick up the gauntlet? Who's gonna do something to lead and to help? And the fact that they had this document in their hand, this epistle from Paul to them, an apostolic epistle that gives them credibility in what they've been called to do. And he's saying it here. First of all, you guys, you're capable. You can do it with God's help. But also, it also says to the people that they're around and that they're dealing with, Paul gives his stamp of approval to these guys. And we know Paul, and we trust Paul. So therefore, we're going to trust Timothy, and we're going to trust Titus. Again, that's reading between the lines, but I think that's got to be something that was of immense value. Gave them street cred within the church. That's kind of a mixing of metaphors, perhaps, but that did give them credibility, and which was really, really important. So anyway, all right. What is the significance of these epistles to the church today? To us at Three Chop? Is this just an academic exercise that we're going to go through for the next 13 weeks? A historical account of what happened long ago, far away, that has absolutely no relevance to me and to us in our life together.
Yeah, I don't find that true. I think it's very relevant, and because it's so, most of it's so encouraging. And each day I've been sending a verse or two out to my family, and call it the family Bible verse of the day or whatever. And it's like so many verses that are so encouraging that I just find myself listing more and more, that I wanna send off to them and say, isn't that a beautiful, they're all beautiful verses, but I mean, maybe one particular that maybe I think is gonna hit them, that day. And like Emily said to me one day, she said, you hit the nail on the head with that verse this morning. And then one of my sons said one time, he said, Mom, you just send your verse out this morning. Well, I've got something got me tied up, I didn't get it out till later, but he noticed, he texted me and said, you didn't. But anyway, I really like the encouraging words and like you said, you can do this, be strong, you can do this,
Okay.
Since it's God breathed, I believe it is.
Well, yeah, and that's, and we're gonna read that verse and study that
I
verse.
only agree with them if we have times now where there's disagreements in the church or people outside the church look down on us.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise I don't agree with what y'all are saying.
That never happens, does it,
No.
Mark? No, yeah. Yeah. But isn't it important for us today to have responsible leadership in the church? You ever been in a church that didn't have responsible leadership? It's tragic.
I think,
Yes.
I just think it tells us here that there's just not one person that's leading. We have elders, and it says here that
Plural.
there's more than one.
Yeah.
And when churches just have one, I think it's not. It's
Yeah.
not healthy, maybe, I don't know what my word is.
Well, I think, and again, we are a little bit peculiar in that we have, the multi-elder model of leadership, as opposed to a single pastoral system. With a single pastoral system, there's a temptation for that because there's some great efficiencies that can be done, But, over the years, and, I was an elder and I'm sure it still takes place, the importance of having multiple elders is critical to get that's critically important for making good decisions and making sure that nobody goes off the reservation.
Rod, I don't
Sure.
think that if it wasn't important, that they wouldn't have paid that much attention to it.
Yeah, well, that's,
Because it's very laid out,
mhm.
the responsibilities, what you're to do, and, I think it's there, I think that's what we abide by.
Carol, you were about to say something?
It's just demonstrative to me of how much God adores the church, adores the bride, that he would so meticulously lay out what's gonna be best for us. His love is all through these books, these 3 books.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, this is, instead of being against us and so rigorous and so, it's a loving thing. He wants the church to get along and so I see a great deal of love from God in this.
Jesus sent the disciples out 2 at a time, not 1 at a time.
Mhm.
Because one person-
Multiplicity is kind of a recurring theme, isn't it? What did Paul do? He always took people with him. Jack said, look, he was never alone in his ministry. Never alone in his ministry. And I don't think that we need to isolate our elders, our shepherds. They need to have fellowship. And that's the other thing is, I remember it was Gabe that said, says, being an elder was a lot easier before I was one.
Amen to that.
And, and Jack, he had something he read on last Sunday about, you know, when he was talking toward the end, and it's about elders. It said it should humble us to remember that the church is not ours but God's, and it should inspire us to faithfulness. For sheep are not all the clean and cuddly creatures they may appear. In fact, they are dirty, subject to unpleasant pests, and regularly need to be dipped in strong chemicals to rid them of lice, ticks, and worms. They are unintelligent, wayward, and obstinate. I hesitate to apply the metaphor too closely and characterize the people as dirty, lousy, and stupid. But some people are a great trial for their shepherds. And their shepherds will persevere in caring for them only if they remember how valuable they are in God's sight. They are the flock of God the Father, purchased by the precious blood of God the Son, and supervised by overseers appointed by God the Spirit.
That's awesome.
And
That's
I
really
think
awesome.
that's beautifully,
Yeah.
you know, expressed. And we gotta remember, you know, we are an imperfect bunch at our best. Okay? And we need to, as sheep, to try to be the best sheep we can be, to make these guys, you know, job easier, you know. It's incredible. Well, that was one thing. I think that for the church today, getting responsible leadership is critical, just like it was then. The next is dealing proactively and sometimes reactively with false teachers and distorted doctrine. That's a part of their responsibility. We need to be on the lookout for that as well as sheep, but mainly our shepherds. And that's just as important today as it was, you know, for the people in Ephesus and the people in Crete, the church there. Really important. And then honoring apostolic instructions relative to different roles and constituencies and their expected behavior within the local Christian community. You know, we're all different. We've got different roles. You know, Paul tells us, you know, not everybody's a hand, not everybody's a foot. There's noses and ears and, you know, vertebrae and everything. You know, we're all different. And we have different responsibilities and roles. And that's got to be called together for the good of the church. Again, for our spiritual health, our unity, and our peace. And Paul gives these, you alluded to, these spiritual instructions that lead to a virtuous and godly life. A life of holiness. You know, he gives a lot of that in these, particularly these first two, you know. And so I think that's very important today as well. And just like he did then, he calls us to steadfastness. You know, it was very prominent in Thessalonians. Hang on. Don't move. Be unmovable, unshakable. And he still does that today. So I think we need to continue to, you know, the lessons for the people in Ephesus and the people in Crete are the same ones we need today. When we get to 2 Timothy, it's different. It's Paul's swan song. It's his last book that he writes. He writes it to who else? Timothy, probably his best friend, the guy he feels closest to. And he sees that he's about to be put to death. And it's a very poignant letter. And also it's interesting that just like we do today, I think, or should do today, Paul, towards the end of his life, he's thinking about and talking about, writing about the things that are most important to him. Things that are most important to him. And as some of us who are entering, I'll put it, the late fall of our lives, perhaps, but maybe the early winter. You know, this may be a great lesson for us, particularly. You know, what's important to me? What's important to me? What was important to Paul? Maybe ought to be figuring out that the things that were important to Paul maybe ought to be important to me. And, you know, how you approach that. But I think hopefully it's gonna be a really good study. Jack's gonna be the main cog. I'm just kind of along, you know, pitching coal, he'll be back next week, and what we're gonna do next week, read the first 20 verses of, chapter 1 of 1 Timothy, about his warnings, his example, and his, initial charge to Timothy. And, any other comments or questions?
I just have a question. Just recently, I heard one or two people say that they find Ephesians one of the hardest books to understand in the Bible. I don't think that way at all. I feel like it comes off the page at me. Have you heard that? Anybody else heard that? That Ephesians is supposed to be a real tough book? I don't think so.
Yeah, Rod misspoke early on about the length of the 3 books. You might be wondering, why did they put the swan song in between 1 Timothy and Titus? Because they were probably written 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy, as Rod said. When they collected the Bible, they put the longest books first. So if you look at the groups, 1 Corinthians is longer than 2 Corinthians. 1 John is longer than 2 John. Actually, 3 John has 2 more verses than 2 John. So I'm not sure why it got third. But if you go through 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians is shorter than 1 Thessalonians. They put the longest books first. And that's probably why we have the order 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus.
Instead of
Because 1 Timothy is 6 chapters.
Yeah.
2 Timothy is 5 chapters,
Yeah.
and Titus is 3 chapters.
Chapters, yeah. And the other thing is too, I want you to, I felt a compulsion to write on the board, just because Ben did such a great job of writing on the board for Thessalonians. This is Jack Goodwin's, Mediterranean map.
Mine is much better than
Well,
that.
I'm not sure about that. But anyway, all right, this is, this is Judea over here, Jerusalem, this is Cyprus, and this is, Ephesus is up here, Macedonia, this is probably where Paul sent the letters from, and then down here below, Greece is, Crete, and that's your geography lesson for tonight.
How close is Italy to Greece?
It's to the left.
Yeah.
There's another sea over
There's another
there.
sea over there, okay?
That sea
Adriatic.
between Ephesus and what's the
Asia
word
Minor.
on the left there, Corinth?
Yeah, well, this is Athens, that's in Greece.
Okay, Athens.
Yeah.
That's the Aegean Sea.
Aegean
They
Sea.
talk about the Aegean ministry,
Yeah,
which is the first 3 missionary journeys were all
and
the
the Adriatic Sea is between Greece and.
And when you go to Rome, it's across the Adriatic Sea.
Okay, this has nothing to do with that, but I have a daughter-in-law.
Thank you, good.
That,
I do too.
okay, but she is from Italy. Her mom and dad, her dad was from Italy, the mountains up from Rome. Her mother was from Greece, and they had supposedly a mixed marriage, and they had nothing to do with the families had nothing to do with one another. And nobody's interested in that, but I have never explored why, so now.
Just a marker of tribalism that permeates the earth.
I wouldn't think they would be that,
Yes.
they are very
Yeah.
different.
What about Scotland and Ireland?
Inside it.
Same thing.
Okay, I know Scotland and all, but I just never thought about it, I think. So, but they disowned them.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah,
See y'all next week.
But now.
the seed divides.
Think it's
Thank you.
So I did want to ask the question.
it's about
Well,
trying
trying to
wherever it's
Timothy,
from.
I got a hang picture.